The power of representation is that it shapes how we see ourselves and others. Observed bell hooks, a 20th century thinker whose work significantly informed contemporary understanding of intersectionality, representation, and social justice in culture and media. So, is our society accurately represented in modern day media? Let's dive in and find out. In this episode of Shall We Check It Out, we take a deeper dive into the International Emmy Award winning miniseries Lost Boys and Fairies. Set in Wales, this three-part drama follows Andy and Gabriel, a gay couple who have spent 8 years together and are now keen to adopt. But before he can become a fit parent, Gabriel must come to terms with his own complicated past. In this conversation about representation and diversity in Lost Boys and Fairies, I'll be joined by Michael Hingson, an international authority on diversity and inclusion, and the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Thunderdog, the true story of a blind man, a guide dog, and the triumph of trust. Blind from birth, Michael was raised by sighted parents who instilled in him a strong can-do spirit. After nearly 3 decades in management positions at various high-tech companies, Michael's life changed dramatically on the 11th of September in 2001, when he and his guide dog Roselle escaped from the 78th floor of Tower 1 in the World Trade Center, just moments before it collapsed. Since then, Michael has been traveling the globe sharing his unique survival story and the lessons it offers about trust, courage, and teamwork. Today, he advises some of the world's most influential figures, from a former US president to leading Fortune 500 companies to colleges and universities across the US, on the importance of moving from diversity to inclusion. Hello, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we'll be talking about inclusion and diversity in media and in television in particular. So tell me a little bit about your patterns of consuming television. What role television plays in your life, if any?
I watch television every day. And a couple of things, I think, to define some terms. The bottom line is, well, when I say I watch television, a lot of people say, well, no, you don't. You hear it. Look, if you look up the word to see in the dictionary, one of the definitions of see is to perceive. And the reality is it doesn't matter whether you use your eyes or not. Most people are used to using their eyes, but that's not the only way to perceive or watch or look at or whatever television. And so I watch TV all the time. I turn the TV on when I get up in the morning, and it's on with some of the news, with some other shows in the course of the morning, and and I do it just fine. I do know that there are a number of programs that come on that don't necessarily have enough dialogue for me to always know what is happening. And there are some things, and we can talk about it, but there are some things that are happening to address that. But the other thing about the media in general, television, radio, news, print, and so on, well, there are two. One, people call us visually impaired, and I'm not visually impaired. I think that's an absolutely disgusting term, and more people are recognizing that. And the reason is the same reason as deaf people do not like to be called hearing impaired, because what we don't do is accept the idea of being compared to other people based on how much we hear or see or don't hear or don't see. And in the case of blind people especially, visually impaired is doubly disgusting, because visually I'm not different simply because I don't see. I'm not visually different. Some magnificent, magical thing doesn't overtake me just because I lose my eyesight, no matter who I am. But the other part about it is what I talked about a moment ago, impaired. I'm not impaired simply because I don't see. One of my favorite questions to ask people when I go to speak at events is, tell me what a blind person cannot do. And usually the number one answer is drive a car. Okay, I appreciate that. But then I ask why a blind person can't drive a car. And the number one answer is, well, because they can't see. And the answer is that's wrong. It's not a question of seeing or not seeing. It's a question of information access and acquisition or not. And they're correct. I don't get the information that sighted people get, but the reality is that technology is changing that. And I'm not talking about autonomous vehicles, but for example, the National Federation of the Blind back in 2011 did a demonstration of a vehicle. It was a regular Ford Escape, but it had some modifications to it that industry and universities created. And a blind person, totally blind person, got behind the wheel of that car at the Rolex 24 race in Daytona, just before the Rolex 24 race began, and drove around the Daytona Speedway, passing through an obstacle course, passing another vehicle. The other vehicle, when it was in front of the blind driver, threw out boxes and the blind driver had to avoid them, and other things like that. The reality is that information is becoming available that would allow me to drive. And of course, a lot of people can say, well, but you'll never drive as well as I can. And the answer is that's not necessarily true. The car isn't ready for prime time in the street. And probably what will happen is before it truly becomes ready is that autonomous vehicles will become prevalent enough and all of us will be using them. And very frankly, given the way a lot of people drive today with eyesight, I'm just as glad that we're going to take driving out of the hands of drivers anyway, because they don't drive well. But the reality is I am not visually impaired. I am blind. So a better term is blind and low vision. But the reality is that we've got to get out of this habit of getting people to think that we're less just because we don't see, because it simply is not true. There are blind physicists, there are blind teachers, there are blind psychologists, there are blind authors, there are blind people doing most every work in life. I don't know of any blind football players, but I wouldn't want to play football anyway. But there are certainly blind people who I know of one who was the person who described color for a North Carolina minor league baseball team. And I know of a couple of blind people who have actually played baseball with their high schools. And I don't know exactly what they did and how they did it, but they did it. And they were competitive on the team. So blindness isn't the problem. It's our attitudes about blindness and low vision that are the real problem. But the fact of the matter is that I watch TV like everyone else. And as I said, there are things that are happening that make it better. Probably the biggest is something called audio description. So when I go to theaters today, and when I watch a lot of television today, I can activate a separate track, or in the case of theaters, I get a special set of earphones from the concession stand or someplace in the theater, and I can put them on. And what happens is that there is a special track that plays that during the time that dialogue isn't happening, so when there's action or whatever, there is someone who is reading from a script on the film that describes what the action is that's going on. So I get that information that I otherwise didn't get before. And it does help to have audio description. It isn't the most crucial thing, but it helps.
Right. So do you all, because in terms of television, you can get it from so many places. There is, the broadcasters, like public broadcasters. There is pay TV, cable TV, streamers. So do all of these content providers also provide an option of audio description, or are there just a few of them, or how does that work now?
They don't all. There are costs associated with it, so they don't all provide it, and they don't all provide it for everything. Probably for me, at least from my limited exposure to a lot of it, the provider that has done the best job of doing it is Disney. They've got most all of their programs audio described. Netflix is doing some. They've gotten better at it. Some of the cable television networks are doing it. More and more movies are going into the theaters with audio description available. And it comes in two ways. One, it's based on the film. It's all recorded on tracks on the film. But a new way that it's been visible for a few years is that you can take your cell phone and run a program. And let's say you want to go see some movie. And if the appropriate script has been created and put into this program, my iPhone will listen to the program, and based on the words that it's hearing from the speakers when there's dialogue, it plays during the times that people aren't speaking, it plays from a script that's stored in the iPhone, the audio description. And that offers some really interesting things, because then they don't have to necessarily put it so much in the film itself, which has some cost to it.
But are these programs, or apps that you can download on your phone, free, or do they come with a cost?
Typically, the ones that I've seen so far are free. They get funding from other places. Spectrum TV has one, for example, and it's available to people, and others do as well. When I go to a theater and use their headset, I don't pay extra for that. It is part of providing the service of making the movie available in the theater.
So these are all very interesting and fascinating things that our audience don't necessarily know if they haven't encountered that need. But Lost Boys and Fairies, they were produced, the series was produced for BBC, and BBC usually is pretty good in providing audio description and access to all sorts of audiences with all sorts of special needs, because that's in their mandate. And, you mentioned the cost, so the government covers that cost for providing this particular service, let's call it. So, but today in this episode, I would like to conduct some sort of a social experiment. So I recorded a very short excerpt from episode 1 of the series, and I would like us together to listen to this excerpt. So I cannot see the image either, but of course I've seen the episode. It's a 2-minute excerpt, and then after this excerpt, we will discuss how we understood what's happening in the scene.
Sure.
Are you ready for this experiment?
Let's do it.
Okay, fantastic. So I just explained the context. So Andy and Gabriel, the couple that wants to adopt a child in the series, are at the beginning of this journey of adopting a child, and they're invited to this meet and greet event where they can talk to all the kids that are up for adoption in that particular center or facility or whatever it's called, that place. So they go just from station to station, and they talk to all the kids, and the kids talk to them. And one of the girls that they meet is blind, and this is the scene where they meet the blind girl. Okay, so so let us listen to this scene.
Hi, I'm Andy. What's your name?
My name's Esme. Would you like to sit down?
Of course we would. Hi, Esme. I'm Gabriel, Andy's partner.
Gabriel, like the angel. I was Mary.
Were you now? I bet you were a lovely Mary.
I was, wasn't I, Paula?
You were, sweetheart.
And what are you making there, Esme?
Dinosaur poo.
Excellent. Andy loves nothing more than making dinosaur poo as well. Don't you, Andy?
Yeah.
In fact, many people don't know this, but Andy's actually the second best dinosaur poo maker in the whole world.
Who's the first best then?
Well, you, Esme, of course.
Where did all that come from?
What?
You were lush. I mean, the way you just, I freaked out. God, this is much harder than I thought.
I know.
But you were, amazing with her. You made it look so easy.
That's because... Well, there was no pressure, was there?
What do you mean?
Because I knew there was no way that we would ever take her on.
And that's the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you see in your mind, and what's your understanding and interpretation of the scene?
Well, certainly Andy was very uncomfortable. It would be interesting to hear that same scene with audio description. But clearly Andy was uncomfortable, and clearly while Gabriel may have been somewhat comfortable conceptually with her, he had made up his mind right from the beginning that there was no way that they were going to take Esme. And if that's because she was blind, then that's a problem. I think that the section showed how a lot of people treat or think about blind people. I had a young man once come up to me in a store and said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Well, why are you sorry?" And he said, "Because you can't see." He was 13, and that was his immediate reaction. The problem is we don't teach in the medium or anywhere else really well that just because a person is different, it doesn't mean that they're less than we are. And that is very true for blind people. Years ago, the Gallup Polling Organization, when they were doing surveys of the top fears that people had, one of the top 5 fears for many years in the 70s and 80s was being blind. Not even having a disability, but being blind, because we emphasize eyesight so much, we think that it's the only game in town, and it's just not true. It would have been so much better if instead, although I understand that the show was a lot more about invisible disabilities, but it would have been so much better if Gabriel had have at least said, I like her. I think we should consider her. But he didn't. They were both against it right from the outset, clearly.
What's amazing to me, just listening to you, that you actually recognize that there are like 2 people, and you spot on knew that Andy was the one that was less comfortable with Esme than Gabriel.
Well, because Andy was absolutely silent. He didn't say anything. I've learned to read people. And when Gabriel said something to Andy, Andy didn't say a word. I mean, clearly that was what was going on.
I think really the series did a good job of sound design. Did you detect the change of scenery in the scene?
A little bit.
They changed the location.
There were some differences in sound that gave me that clue, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think they did a good job, because at first you know that they're inside, there are a lot of kids, and then there's the slam of the door and only birds can be heard, and you understand that they're outside, right? So but if this were like a radio play, I'd say the male voices of the 2 actors are too similar for me to discriminate between them. But you didn't seem to have had this problem.
No, they were different.
Okay.
But I'm used to that, right? That's part of the information that I use to know what is occurring that you don't, because you just deal with eyesight and you don't use your other senses in the same way that I do. And I appreciate that, but I really wish that more people would learn to use their other senses as we do. And I think it would benefit them, but the reality is people don't.
You're really spot on about the show being mostly about invisible disabilities, because Gabriel, who now seems more confident than Andy, actually in the course of the series we find out that he has a lot of unresolved trauma, and he has addiction problems that he thought he put to rest, but they resurfaced when he started considering bringing up this new life, for which he's going to be responsible. And then most of the kids that they talk to, they have like either ADHD or spectrum disorder. So it's more about invisible disabilities, whereas Esme is the only girl that is blind, and you can actually see her. So at the very beginning of the scene, and I guess you would get that from audio description, when they come up to her from the back, and once they say hello, she lifts her head, and then they see her eyes, and they see that she's blind, right? And this is where the hesitation happens.
But why do they say she's blind when they see her eyes? That's part of my point, is that if they make it that obvious, that's a problem.
You mean the creators, right? In the show, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so why?
Because blind people don't necessarily look different simply because they're blind.
Mm.
And if creators constantly use that kind of technique to distinguish a blind person from someone who is light dependent or not blind, that's a problem, because the reality is that it shouldn't matter. But they drove the point home a little bit harder. The point is that they had something dealing with her eyes. And that's just not normally necessarily the case at all.
So yeah, so they really were driving the point very hard that she's very different, this girl.
But that reinforces this typical stereotypical attitudes that we face.
True. And it actually, I had a very similar reaction to you to the scene. It made me uncomfortable. I understand that one of the points of the scene is to show that maybe the two guys are not ready to adopt a child because they're not ready to accept another human being just the way he or she is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, over the course of the series, we see that that's true. They have to figure this out to resolve their own issues before
Right.
they can accept a child into their family. But my issue with that is that it was never vocally addressed. So yes, on the one hand, the girl is like really made visibly disabled so that you cannot miss it. But the guys
Visibly different.
Yeah.
And again, I won't even deal with disabled because that's a relative term. But anyway, go ahead.
True. So, and then the guys never explicitly talk about that, So Gabriel says, well, it's obvious we're not going to take her. Andy doesn't confront him. It's the only scene in the series where we see a visibly blind character, and then those two other characters, they do not address their reaction to that. And what that does to me in terms of my relationship with the characters, it's then in the course of the series, to me, it's very difficult to empathize with them.
Well, and I'm not an ophthalmologist, but I don't know that I would even necessarily say visibly blind. I wonder if there are sighted people that have eye conditions that are such that maybe they may not make eye contact, or their eyes are a particular color. I mean, there are a lot of different issues. But the point is that they really went about it in not a very good way. And all they did in that section was continue to reinforce the typical stereotype issues that people have about blind people. Oh, they look different. Their eyes are different. And as you pointed out, Andy and Gabriel didn't even mention that she was blind or talk about that. It continues to just promote the fear. So it's very unfortunate that the creators went about it in that way.
I do agree. And one of the goals of the creators in this film is to show that, or miniseries is to show that we all have fears and we all have unresolved trauma and we all have to work on that. And everything we do is kind of a result of that, of unresolved trauma, our bad actions. So we are supposed to empathize with Gabriel, who then continues to have all those issues throughout the series. But this scene somehow broke that relationship or that empathy for me.
But if they do that at my expense, that's a problem. And they did. And
true.
So that's an issue.
Totally true.
And I'm also not saying that a blind person necessarily or should be a superhero or anything like that. But
right.
they should deal with it. They didn't deal with it in a very good way at all. They didn't deal with it in terms of Esme the person at all. And that's unfortunate. And they focused on one thing and they wouldn't even deal with that very well. So that's unfortunate.
And I think, I talked about in my intro, I talked about intersectionality and how important it is. So I remember once I was at this talk where a person talked about diversity and inclusion. He was like a CEO of a big international corporation. And he said, like, you cannot compartmentalize inclusion or diversity. If you're talking about diversity of, let's say, queer people in this case, or Northern Irish people or Welsh people, as they do in this series, you cannot then just say that other types of diversity do not matter. So if you are treating diversity equally, you have to treat it equally across sections,
And the other problem is that most diversity people don't even include disabilities because they're afraid of them. And what I point out to people is disability does not mean a lack of ability, but my diversity friends say it does because they say it starts with dis. And my response is, So does disciple, so does discern, so does discreet. But disciple isn't a lack of Eiffel, It doesn't matter that it begins with dis. The reality is disability is a characteristic that every single person on the planet has. For most people, the disability is that they're light dependent. You all are light dependent. You don't do well if suddenly the lights go out. Thomas Edison and others invented the electric light bulb back in 1878. And if we use the terminology from the Americans with Disabilities Act today, all the electric light bulb is a reasonable accommodation to cover up your disability of light dependence. And we've focused on making that process even better for the last 148 years. Well, that's fine. But again, if you do that at the expense of people who don't happen to deal with light dependency, us light independent people, that's a problem. But that's what people typically do.
When we talk about representation, and you already kind of explained to us why representation of this blind girl was not accurate in the series, I then started thinking about other films or series where blind people are represented accurately. I couldn't come up with anything convincing. Do you know?
No.
Oh, no?
In reality, generally not. I mean, there have been a lot of TV shows. There was a show that was on for a number of years, Longstreet, here in the United States, and I'm sure it went all over. The guy was blind. He was an investigator, but he didn't necessarily get dealt with or deal with things necessarily based on just being blind. Even, A Scent of a Woman with Al Pacino, the same sort of thing. But let me also deal with it another way. You don't ever see a blind person typically portraying a blind person in any of these roles. Even Little House on the Prairie didn't use a blind person to play the blind person, but what they did do at least was spend a lot of time with people from the National Federation of the Blind learning about blindness. So they were probably as accurate as anyone was as far as dealing with blindness overall. But the reality is that typically blind people don't play blind people. And the reality is we should be able to do that.
Yeah. So yes, The Scent of a Woman is probably, the most famous film that has a central character who's blind. But you don't think that's an accurate representation?
Not necessarily at all. There are several like that. Daredevil was another one. The guy had superpowers. Well, it's great, but again, we're not dealing with portraying blind people very well, and that's unfortunate.
So what do you think The Scent of a Woman lacked? I'm using this example because probably most of our listeners will know this film, right?
Well, Al Pacino drove around and all that, and the reality is back in those days the technology didn't exist to do that, but he did it anyway, and people thought it was cute, but it wasn't realistic. Just the whole overall tone of blindness as the media portrays it is not very accurate. And like I said, if they had done that better, they would have had a blind person. And I realize they wanted a famous actor, but that's what the media does. And they're providing unrealistic portrayals of so many things.
Do you think that affects the way blind people are perceived in general?
Oh, absolutely.
One example that you gave from real life when this person came up to you and said, "I'm sorry for you."
Like I mentioned, the Gallup polling organization said one of the top 5 fears for years was blindness. It's not today, mainly because there are other fears that have become much stronger,
right?
Or that are more visible. But the fact of the matter is, look, the unemployment rate among employable blind people in this world today is close to 70%, 70%. It's not because blind people can't work. It is because sighted people think blind people can't work. I've had interviews canceled when it was discovered that I was blind, even though they loved my resume. But all that went out the window when they discovered that I was blind. And that's unfortunate. Again, there are so many examples of how blind people get treated and how we don't get the opportunities that we should. There are organizations like the Colorado Center for the Blind, which is an organization in Littleton, Colorado, that teach blind people how to function. But the real majority of what those agencies teach, the ones that do it well, is their teaching attitude. They're teaching that blindness isn't the problem. They're giving blind people the confidence. They're showing them how to build that confidence. And a lot of agencies don't do that because they're still dealing with blindness from an outmoded way of dealing with it, and that's a problem. There are just so many examples that continue to happen, and the media is not helping. Ironsides was a television show that was on. It was a guy who was shot, played by Raymond Burr. So Raymond Burr was in a wheelchair for years as a paralyzed guy. Why they didn't use a person in a wheelchair, but those things happen. My wife, who was in a wheelchair her whole life, wasn't a great fan of Ironsides because she felt that there were things that weren't portrayed very well. The reality is the media overall wants to try to respond to what people think something ought to be as opposed to what it really ought to be, until they want to do something in a more realistic way. But the reality is that they don't portray disabilities very appropriately in a lot of what they do.
So coming back to Lost Boys and Fairies, you cannot say that it's a show about inclusivity if you leave this one character who is blind, if you leave her out, right? If you do not deal with that properly.
Yeah, deal with it properly. They still might not adopt her, but they could have dealt with it in a whole lot better way than they did. Yeah. And I also believe, so a lot of my diversity friends, as I mentioned earlier, don't ever tend to talk about or deal with disabilities, which means no matter what they say, they're not inclusive. You can't be partially inclusive. You either are inclusive or you're not.
Yes.
And if you're not, if you leave out disabilities in any way, you're not inclusive. It's a yes or no across the board. And it's the way it ought to be. Diversity, many diversity people have told me, well, disabilities aren't a minority. Well, that's just a lot of malarkey, as Joe Biden used to say, because the reality is 25%, roughly speaking, of people have some sort of a so-called standard disability. Like I said, I think everyone does, because I think we need to redefine the term disability. Disability is a characteristic that everyone has in some way. It manifests itself differently for different people, but everyone has a disability.
So you are a content creator yourself. You have a podcast and you produce a podcast. Tell us a little bit about what are the challenges that you had to overcome in this process and how you did that.
It's a lot easier now than it was years ago. I used to work when I was in college at the university radio station. And as I love to tell people, I was not really the greatest at splicing tape together when you had to cut something out. And I just wasn't. And some people were neither than I. I kind of could do it, although it didn't necessarily look good, but I could do it. But now there are technologies that allow me to do editing if I need to do editing. I can use some of the same filter technology that other people use to filter out noises and so on. And I can edit when I need to my podcast. I actually have someone else that does a lot of that because a lot of the time I'm out speaking elsewhere.
Right.
But the reality is that the technology has grown a lot. There's a program called Reaper that's not very expensive. It's a great audio editor. Scripts and other technologies have been written around or in Reaper that allow me to use it the same way other people who are sighted use it. And I can edit as well as anyone now using Reaper without any difficulty whatsoever. The fact of the matter is that the technologies are getting better. Artificial intelligence is helping a lot. It's helping in some ways to make more accessibility available on websites, although AI is by no means perfect, but it's helping. I have a pair of smart glasses that I can put on, and I can tell the glasses to describe the scene that it sees or describe what's around me. And it can do that very accurately. I can walk through an airport and it will read the numbers of the gates because it's smart enough to know to look for gate numbers when I'm at an airport. That's what AI can do. So there are a lot of things that are making life better that will continue to improve.
So now we as content creators who, let's say, write series and who want to be inclusive in those series or films, what should we do better? What could we do better? What measures can we take to be more inclusive?
The first thing, let's say we're dealing with blindness for the moment. First of all, I would work a lot harder at finding good blind actors to be involved. The second thing I would do is a lot more research and truly get to the point where you understand something about blindness and blind people, don't go by your assumptions, which are most likely not nearly as accurate as they ought to be. The third is get over your fears. Get over your fears about people who are different, especially as I'm dealing with it, blindness, but get over your fears about people who are different. Find out what it's really like. If you're going to portray a blind person, find out the truth about blindness and then go from there. And one person isn't necessarily the best example. You need to really look much deeper than one person. I've had several times when I've talked with someone and we've talked about some of these same things and say, well, we talked to a blind person. We know. No, you don't. Just like when you talk to a one-sighted person, you don't know. If you're truly doing research, do the research right.
So the actress who played Esme, her name is Nell Sutton, and she is actually blind, in fact.
Okay.
So they did that right, I suppose, right?
No, well, not necessarily. I don't know about her, but I could point to so many blind people whose eyes don't look at all blind, who don't look like that. All I'm saying is they did it to drive a point, but it wasn't a very good point. It's still not what they should have done directly, because if her eyes look weird, then that's continuing to reinforce the attitude about blind people's eyes look weird, and that's not necessarily true at all. There are so many other ways they could have taken it that would have provided a much more positive view about blindness, but that's not what they chose to do, which is a problem.
As you said, you cannot be partially inclusive, right? We talked about the creators. Now let's talk about media outlets or the companies that actually distribute the content. As you said, there's an extra cost involved in making their products accessible to blind people. And they can say, oh, well, it's such a small section of our audience, so maybe we will not invest in making our content accessible to them. What would you say to that?
It violates the law because with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the European standards and so on, it's part of what they have to do to truly make content inclusive, and they're required by law nowadays to do it. Only about 3 to maybe as many as 4%, but I don't even know if it's 4. It's still closer to 3% of all websites are inclusive and accessible. Most are not. I can go to most websites and find lots of things that aren't accessible about them. Amazon's getting a little better, but there's still issues with that. Audible, which is owned by Amazon, has things that aren't inclusive. I can go to the LA Times, or I can go to ABC News, or even my local ABC affiliate, Channel 7 here, and stuff isn't accessible all the time. They don't label links properly. They don't describe images. There's so many things that they don't do, and they don't regard that as a priority, which is not the way it ought to be. And if you get in the habit of doing it, it becomes easy. And none of that costs really to do, other than a little bit of time. But that's not what the media does.
It all comes back to this attitude that somehow, blind people are somehow a less important audience than the rest of us. But as you said, we all have some sort of disability, right? So why single out this one or another one?
Well, because the reality is that most people don't think they have a disability, and they don't until suddenly the lights go out and they don't happen to have a smartphone or a flashlight nearby. But then as soon as they have one, it's gone away now. The reality is it is all attitudinal and educational.
I have a standard question at the end of the conversation to all of my guests. So I'm going to ask you that question too. Should we check it out, the series? Are you intrigued enough to check it out? Lost Boys and Fairies.
Oh, sure. I think it's important that we all check it out. And I think that people should check out blindness. The Foundation Fighting Blindness, which is an organization here in the U.S., back in 2016, put up a website called How I See It. The I was spelled EYE. And what they did was they challenged their members to put on blindfolds, and then they suggested a bunch of tasks to perform, anything from buying something at a store to preparing something. And the whole point was that they wanted to show how difficult it was for blind people to do that stuff. It isn't difficult for blind people to do that stuff. It's difficult for people who aren't trained to do that stuff. Sighted people get trained as they grow up normally, but the reality is when we who are blind discovered it, we started putting videos up on the site showing what blind people can do. And in fact, we overwhelmed the site and eventually crashed it because there were so many videos showing what blind people can do. And eventually the foundation stopped it, which they should never have begun it in the first place. But the fact of the matter is, we've got to recognize that blindness isn't the problem. It's people's attitudes.
And media certainly plays an important role, you know, when it comes to shaping people's attitudes. So yes, so we can definitely do better. And I think you gave really good, valuable advice on how to do it. So thank you for that very much, Michael. Now we know what we have to do, and hopefully people who listen to this, content creators and media outlets will take that on board and will take those actions.
Hope so. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and a joy to be here.